Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're just going to take a very quick look at the latest budget update. It's 2020 and we haven't got the 2020-2021 budget just yet because the federal government postponed it until October because of all the uncertainty surrounding COVID-19. So usually the budget is handed down in May of each year, but not this year. But what we've had recently in terms of sort of late July, early August 2020 is an update on how the federal budget is tracking. And so there's a couple of points that I wanted to share, which would be very useful for you in terms of putting the story together about fiscal policy and the kind of things you could write in terms of short answer or extended responses in terms of how the stance and the outcome of fiscal policy has changed due to the impact of COVID-19. So I'll link to the article and I'll put a photo of it up here as well. The federal government had been forecasting a $5 billion surplus for 2019-2020. So that's the financial year that starts on 1 July 2019, finishes on 30th of June 2020. So that the actual situation is a deficit of $86 billion. If we think about the impact of COVID, that what has happened is that the government has had to accelerate spending, both structural spending, so programs like JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but also cyclical spending, those automatic stabilizers where unemployment benefits have kicked in because more and more people are out of a job, and that has increased G in the budget. That has increased government spending. On the other side, if you think about the sources of government revenue in terms of taxation, well, that has plummeted because if people lose their job or their hours are cut, okay, earn less income, so therefore less tax revenue. But also, if companies are closed or selling less, those kinds of things because of the pandemic, then they're going to be paying less company tax. So you can see how a $5 billion surplus can turn into a large deficit, $84 billion deficit. So what we can say is that because of COVID, the outcome has gone from surplus to deficit, okay? But also that the stance has gone from maybe mildly contractionary, where the deficit is, they're trying to shrink the deficit and create a surplus, to a really high spending, lower revenue budget to try and accelerate economic activity, which is highly expansionary. As an example of that kind of increased spending, this is a deliberate spending measure, so structural or discretionary factor, that the JobKeeper program, which is paying a wage subsidy to employers to allow them to keep their staff on, that's going to cost $86 billion, according to the federal government. So you can see how that large jump in spending is really responsible in part for that change in budget outcome and budget stance. So one of the major problems in terms of the pandemic is the rise in unemployment. If you think about it, that is reducing government revenue, increasing government spending, and also creating a very challenging situation for many individuals. According to the government's own stats, they think that the unemployment rate will peak at 9.25% by the end of 2020. In terms of some context, that represents 1.2 million Australians without a job. This is a significant challenge for the Australian economy. So part of the way that the government is explaining the change from this surplus to deficit is this idea that we had to do something. That if the government didn't act, they argue, that unemployment would be much higher and the Australian economy would be in a much worse situation.
So, I mean, you asked about the levels of debt as a result, of where we are here today. I ask you, what is the alternative? I mean, are you suggesting that we shouldn't have provided the support we did to boost our health system, to protect jobs, to protect livelihoods? I mean, in the circumstances, what was the alternative? The second point is, and we've got to really keep this in context. Our debt level as a share of GDP, even now, is lower than the debt level as a share of GDP of many other countries around the world before we went into the coronavirus crisis.
So in terms of the way that the Morrison government is explaining this to the Australian people, they are saying we had to act and we had to act to this level to try and protect employment. In terms of effectiveness and success and all these things, it's too early to tell at this point in terms of the kind of ongoing outbreaks across Australia and how long this pandemic could last. That's still a challenging and unknown situation. But in terms of your own responses and how you're explaining it, you can very much talk about that change in outcome and stance in fiscal policy, that rise in government spending, cyclical as well as structural, and that reduction in government revenue and that taxation revenue has led to that change in outcome and that change in stance. Now, we'll keep a close eye on how this budget situation evolves, but I thought it was important to give an update now so that we have a bit more context when the next one comes through. Okay, if you've got any questions, comments, clarifications, just put them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.